Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us deepest. For Lady Isolde, that truth comes crashing down when her husband's hand strikes her face in front of an entire courtroom. She stands accused of betrayal, but Lord Edric's violence reveals who the real betrayer is. The crowd expects her to submit in silence. Instead, a voice cuts through the stone hall like a blade. "Lay hand on her again, and I shall remind the realm what fear tastes like." The speaker is Alaric, an ancient vampire bound by old magic to protect her bloodline. He has watched from the shadows for generations, but now he steps into the light. This is the story of a woman finding her strength with help from an immortal protector. It's about breaking free from those who would control us, even when that freedom comes with a dangerous price. But what happens when the cure becomes more frightening than the disease? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years had passed since Lady Isolde first stepped through the iron gates of Ravenshollow Keep as a bride, her heart heavy with the weight of an arranged marriage she had never wanted. The memory of that autumn day still haunted her the way the ancient stones seemed to drink in the pale sunlight, casting long shadows that reached toward her like grasping fingers. Her father had assured her that Lord Edric was a good match, a man of standing who would protect their family's interests in these turbulent northern lands. How wrong he had been. The keep itself told a story of former grandeur, now fading into grim necessity. Built of dark granite quarried from the surrounding mountains, Ravenshollow had stood for over 4 centuries, its towers reaching toward grey skies that seemed perpetually pregnant with snow. The great hall bore tapestries depicting ancient battles and forgotten victories, their colours dulled by smoke from countless winter fires. Even in the height of summer, cold draughts whispered through the corridors, carrying with them the scent of old stone and older secrets. Isolde had learned to navigate these halls with quiet grace, though she never felt at home within them. The servants whispered that the keep was cursed, built upon land that had once belonged to beings far older than mortal men. She dismissed such talk as superstition until strange things began happening around her shadows that moved without cause, animals that watched her with 2 intelligent eyes, and dreams filled with voices, speaking words in languages she did not recognize, yet somehow understood. The bloodstone pendant that had belonged to her grandmother hung at her throat, a family heirloom passed down through generations of women in her line. It was a beautiful piece. The deep red stone shot through with veins of silver that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Her mother had insisted she wear it always, claiming it would protect her from harm. Isolde had thought it merely a pretty trinket until recently, when the stone had begun to grow warm against her skin at odd moments, as if responding to some unseen presence. Lord Edric had been different during their courtship, charming, attentive, even gentle. The transformation began gradually, after their wedding vows were spoken. First came the restrictions on her movements, then the accusations about her correspondence with family and friends. He claimed to be protecting her reputation, but Isolde recognized the chains being forged link by link around her freedom. When she tried to maintain relationships outside the keep, his anger would flare like a winter storm, sudden and violent. The household staff had grown to love her despite, or perhaps because, of the careful way she moved through their world. Marta, her elderly maid, had served the keep for longer than anyone could remember. Her lined face held wisdom earned through decades of silent observation, and her eyes saw far more than she ever spoke aloud. She tended to Isolde with a fierce protectiveness that went beyond mere duty, often appearing at precisely the moments when comfort was most needed. Father Benedict, the keep's priest, was a man caught between his faith and his conscience. His sermons spoke of forgiveness and obedience, but his private conversations with Isolde revealed a soul troubled by what he witnessed within these walls. He had known her family before her marriage and remembered her as a spirited child, full of laughter. The subdued woman she had become grieved him deeply, though he struggled with the Church's teachings about wifely submission and masculine authority. Sir Gareth served as captain of Edric's guard, a position that required both military skill and political cunning. Unlike his lord, Gareth was a man of genuine honour who took no pleasure in the gradual crushing of Isolde's spirit. He had served noble families before and recognized the difference between firm leadership and cruel domination. His loyalty to his oath of service warred constantly with his growing disgust at Edric's treatment of his wife. The political situation surrounding Ravenshollow had grown increasingly tense as neighbouring lords questioned Edric's fitness to rule. His paranoia had begun affecting trade relationships and military alliances that had taken generations to build. Whispers circulated at court gatherings about his erratic behaviour and the strange incidents that seemed to follow in his wake. Some suggested that divine judgment was manifesting through supernatural means, while others simply saw opportunity in his weakness. The marriage contract that bound Isolde to Edric was an ornate document, signed in both ink and blood according to ancient custom. She had thought the blood requirement merely symbolic, until Marta mentioned in passing that certain contracts required supernatural consent as well as mortal agreement. The parchment itself was beautiful work, illuminated with gold leaf and decorated with intricate border designs that seemed to shift in candlelight. Hidden among the decorative elements were symbols that meant nothing to mortal eyes, but carried deep significance for those who understood older forms of writing. Winter in the northern lands was a test of endurance that separated the strong from the weak. The cold penetrated even the thickest stone walls, and the wind carried voices that might have been memory or prophecy. Isolde found herself drawn to the tower windows during snowstorms, watching the way the white curtain obscured the boundaries between earth and sky. In those moments of blindness and beauty, she felt closest to something greater than the small world of her captivity. The accusations that had led to her trial had begun 3 months ago when Edric discovered her writing letters to her sister. He claimed the messages contained coded information about troop movements and defensive preparations, though anyone reading them would have found only family gossip and gentle inquiries about health and happiness. His paranoia had reached the point where he saw conspiracy in every gesture and betrayal in every kindness. The servants spoke in hushed tones about the keep's history, particularly the time before memory when other lords had ruled these lands. They whispered of a dark lord who had commanded both fear and respect, whose justice had been swift and absolute. Some claimed he had never truly died, but merely withdrawn from mortal sight, waiting for the proper moment to reclaim what was his. Others insisted that powerful beings still walked the earth in secret, bound by ancient laws and older loyalties. Isolde's dreams had grown increasingly vivid as the trial approached. She saw herself walking through halls she did not recognize, speaking with figures whose faces remained hidden in shadow. A voice would call her name in languages that predated the common tongue, and she would wake with the taste of copper and starlight on her lips. The bloodstone pendant would be warm against her skin on these mornings, as if it had absorbed heat from whatever realm her sleeping mind had visited. The great hall where her trial was to be held had witnessed centuries of judgment and ceremony. The high ceiling was supported by carved columns depicting scenes of justice and retribution, their stone faces worn smooth by time and the touch of countless hands. The Lord's chair sat upon a raised dais, positioned to give the occupant both physical and psychological dominance over all who came before it. Heavy iron chandeliers provided light that cast more shadows than it banished, creating an atmosphere of ancient authority and hidden judgment. As the day of her trial approached, strange incidents increased around the keep. Guards reported seeing figures moving through corridors where no one should be, and horses in. The stable grew restless without apparent cause. Father Benedict found his chapel rearranged in subtle ways that suggested someone had been conducting ceremonies using different rituals than those sanctified by the church. Marta discovered symbols carved into hidden places throughout the keep, markings that hurt the eyes to look upon directly and seemed to whisper of powers that mortality was not meant to comprehend. The political implications of Isolde's trial extended far beyond the keep's walls. If found guilty of treason, her family's holdings could be seized and their alliances dissolved. Neighboring lords watched the proceedings with interest, some hoping to benefit from any redistribution of power, and others concerned about the precedent being set. The accusation of betrayal between husband and wife struck at the foundation of noble marriage as both political alliance and personal bond. On the morning of her trial, Isolde dressed with particular care, choosing garments that reflected both her noble birth and her acceptance of whatever judgment might come. The bloodstone pendant lay against her throat like a drop of heart's blood, warm and reassuring in a way that defied rational explanation. She had no way of knowing that forces far older than mortal law were already moving to ensure that justice, true justice, would be served before the day was done. The trial itself was a formality designed to provide legal cover for Edric's predetermined verdict. He had gathered witnesses whose testimony could be bought or coerced, and arranged for a judgment that would remove Isolde as an obstacle to his increasingly desperate political maneuvering. What he had not anticipated was that some oaths of protection ran deeper than law, older than custom, and stronger than the fear that kept mortal men silent in the face of injustice. As Isolde walked toward the great hall that morning, her spine straight and her head held high, despite the fear that gnawed at her heart, she could not have imagined that her trial would become the fulcrum upon which the balance between mortal and supernatural power would shift forever. The pendant at her throat pulsed with warmth, responding to the approach of forces that had been gathering for decades in preparation for this moment. The ancient stones of Ravenshallow Keep held their breath, waiting for the confrontation that would determine whether justice belonged to those with earthly power or to those bound by laws written in blood and starlight. In a few short hours, Lady Isolde would learn that she was far more than a nobleman's wife. She was the heir to a legacy that stretched back through generations of women who had walked between worlds, protected by guardians whose loyalty transcended death itself. The great hall of Ravenshallow Keep had never felt more oppressive than it did on the morning of Lady Isolde's trial. The assembled nobles and household members shifted uncomfortably on the wooden benches, their whispered conversations creating a low murmur that echoed off the ancient stone walls. Lord Edric sat in his high chair like a king preparing to pass judgment, his face a mask of righteous anger that barely concealed the satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. Isolde stood in the center of the hall, her hands bound before her with silk cords that were meant to appear ceremonial but cut into her wrists with each movement. The bloodstone pendant at her throat caught the morning light streaming through the narrow windows, its deep red surface seeming to pulse with inner fire. She had dressed simply but with dignity, choosing a gown of deep blue wool that had belonged to her mother. If she was to face condemnation, she would do so as the daughter of her bloodline, not as the broken chattel Edric sought to display. Lady Isolde of Ravenshallow. Edric's voice rang out across the hall, each word carefully chosen to emphasize his authority over her very identity. You stand, accused of treasonous correspondence with enemies of this house, of betraying the sacred trust of marriage, and of endangering the lives of those sworn to our protection. The charges hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy and suffocating. Father Benedict shifted uncomfortably in his place, near the altar that had been moved into the hall for the ceremony. His weathered hands clutched his prayer book, but his eyes held doubt rather than conviction. Sir Gareth stood at attention with the other guards, his jaw set in a hard line that spoke of internal struggle. Isolde lifted her chin, meeting her husband's gaze directly. I stand accused, my lord, but not guilty of the crimes you claim. Silence! Edric's hand slammed against the arm of his chair, the sound cracking like thunder in the enclosed space. "You will speak only when questioned, and you will answer truthfully or face the consequences of your continued defiance." Marta, seated among the household servants, pressed her, lips together in a thin line. Her aged hands worked nervously at the fabric of her apron, fingers tracing patterns that might have been mere fidgeting or something far more deliberate. The old woman's eyes held knowledge that went deeper than her role as lady's maid, secrets passed down through generations of service to noble houses that understood the old ways. "The evidence speaks clearly," Edric continued, rising from his chair to pace before the assembled court. "Letters written in her hand, detailing our defences and questioning the loyalty of our allies. Meetings held in secret places, away from the watchful eyes of those charged with protecting her virtue and our security." Sir Gareth knew the truth of those accusations. The letters contained nothing more dangerous than sisterly concern for family health and gentle inquiries about life beyond the keep's walls. The secret meetings were solitary walks in the garden where Lady Isolde sought moments of peace away from her husband's increasingly volatile presence. Yet truth mattered less than power in halls like these, and Edric held all the legal authority needed to reshape reality to suit his purposes. Furthermore, Edric's voice grew harder. "She has shown willful disobedience to lawful commands and demonstrated a rebellious spirit that threatens the very foundation of Christian marriage and noble duty." Father Benedict winced at the invocation of religious authority for what was clearly a political execution. His vows required him to support the sanctity of marriage, but his conscience recoiled from being used to justify cruelty masquerading as righteousness. The priest had known Isolde since she was a child visiting the keep with her family. The vibrant, laughing girl, he remembered, bore little resemblance to the pale, careful woman standing trial for crimes that existed only in her husband's paranoid imagination. "What say you to these charges?" Edric demanded, his voice rising to fill every corner of the hall. Isolde drew a breath that seemed to pull strength from some deep reservoir she had not known she possessed. "I say that fear makes cowards of us all, my lord. Fear of losing power, fear of facing truth, fear of admitting when we have become the very evil we claim to fight." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the assembled witnesses. No one spoke to Lord Edric in such terms, certainly not a woman bound by law and accustomed to obedience. The silence that followed was pregnant with danger and the potential for violence. Edric's face flushed red with rage, his carefully maintained composure cracking like thin ice over deep water. "You dare!" His words were cut short by the sound of his own hand striking her cheek. The slap echoed through the hall like a thunderclap, sharp and brutal in the heavy silence. Isolde's head snapped to the side, her bound hands unable to shield her face or ease the burning pain that bloomed across her skin. The assembled crowd gasped as one, the sound of their collective shock creating a strange harmony of horror and fascination. Even in an age where wives were considered property, striking a noblewoman during formal proceedings crossed lines that civilized men were supposed to respect. Father Benedict half rose from his seat, his face pale with outrage, while Sir Gareth's hand moved instinctively toward his sword before he caught himself. "That," said a voice from the shadows at the back of the hall, "was a mistake." Every head turned toward the sound, eyes straining to pierce the gloom that seemed suddenly deeper than it had been moments before. A figure emerged from the darkness between the great pillars, moving with a fluid grace that suggested both great age and predatory power. He was tall and lean, dressed in black clothing that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His hair was dark, with threads of silver that caught the weak sunlight like captured starlight. And his eyes burned like coals in the depths of a winter fire. "Who dares interrupt these lawful proceedings?" Edric demanded, though his voice carried less authority than it had moments before. Something about the stranger's presence filled the hall with an electric tension that made the air itself seem to thicken and pulse. The man stepped into the light with deliberate slowness, each movement calculated to display both confidence and barely restrained power. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries and the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "I am Alaric, and these lands knew my rule long before your grandfather's grandfather drew his first breath." He paused, letting the impossible implications of that statement settle over the stunned audience. "I am bound by oaths older than your understanding to protect the bloodline you have just struck." Edric laughed, though the sound held more hysteria than humor. "Madman! Guards, arrest this fool who claims, lay hand on her again." Alaric interrupted, his voice cutting through Edric's bluster like a blade through silk. "And I shall remind the realm what fear tastes like." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sir Gareth found his hand frozen on his sword hilt, unable to complete the motion of drawing the blade. Around the hall, other guards stood similarly paralyzed, caught between duty and an instinctive understanding that they faced something far beyond their ability to comprehend or combat. Alaric reached into his dark coat and withdrew a silver ring bearing the carved image of a raven. He placed it deliberately on the wooden table that had been set up for the trial's evidence, the metal making a small clicking sound that seemed to echo with unnatural resonance. "This signet ring bore witness to oaths sworn in blood and starlight 3 centuries ago," he said, his words carrying to every corner of the silent Ridgew Hall. "It sealed agreements between your ancestor and mine regarding the protection of certain bloodlines in exchange for certain considerations. Those agreements have never been rescinded." Father Benedict stared at the ring, his mind racing through half-remembered legends and fragments of history that the Church had spent generations trying to suppress or explain away. The raven crest was familiar from old tapestries and carved stones throughout the keep, symbols he had always assumed were merely heraldic decoration. Now they took on new and terrifying significance. Isolde felt the bloodstone pendant growing warm against her throat, its heat spreading through her body like wine on a cold morning. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. Whatever this man was, whatever he represented, his presence had shifted the balance of power in the hall as surely as an avalanche reshapes a mountainside. "Impossible," Edric whispered, though his face had gone pale as winter frost. Alaric smiled, and the expression held no warmth whatsoever. "Many things are possible that mortal men choose not to believe, but belief is not required for truth, nor ignorance a shield against consequences." He turned his attention to Isolde, and she saw something in his ancient eyes that she had almost forgotten existed, genuine concern for her well-being that asked nothing in return. "The choice is yours, Lady Isolde," he said softly. "Accept what protection can be offered, or continue to suffer what need not be endured." Before she could respond, Alaric had vanished, not moved quickly or stepped back into shadows, but simply ceased to be present in the space he had occupied. The only evidence of his visit was the silver ring on the table and the memory of words that would reshape the destiny of everyone in Ravenshallow Keep. The silence that followed lasted only moments before it shattered into chaos. The great hall erupted into chaos as soon as Alaric vanished. Nobles leaped from their seats, servants crossed themselves and whispered prayers, and guards drew weapons against an enemy who was no longer present to fight. Lord Edric stood frozen beside his chair, staring at the empty space where the impossible figure had stood moments before, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been terror. "Sorcery!" he finally managed to shout above the din. "Guards, search every corner of this keep, find this pretender, and bring him to me in chains." Sir Gareth knew the futility of such orders, even as he moved to obey them. Whatever they had witnessed went beyond mere illusion or sleight of hand. The very air in the hall still hummed with residual energy that made his teeth ache and his sword feel heavy in its sheath. Still, duty demanded action, and he began organizing search parties with the grim efficiency of a man who understood that sometimes orders must be followed even when they made no sense. Isolde remained standing in the center of the hall, her bound hands trembling slightly as she touched the bloodstone pendant with her fingertips. The warm pulse of the stone had grown stronger since Alaric's appearance, beating in rhythm with her heart as if the two had become synchronized. Around her, the chaos continued, but she felt strangely removed from it all, as if she stood in the eye of a storm that raged without touching her. Father Benedict approached her carefully, his weathered face creased with concern and confusion. "My lady," he said softly, "are you harmed?" "That blow, I am well, father," Isolde replied, though her cheek still burned where Edric's hand had struck. "Better than I have been in many months." The priest studied her face, noting something different in her expression, a spark that had been missing for far too long. "What did you make of that man's claims?" "Such stories as he told. Stories have a way of being more true than those who hear them are willing to believe," Isolde said, her voice carrying a new note of certainty that surprised them both. Before Father Benedict could respond, Marta appeared at Isolde's side with the silent efficiency that had made her invaluable to the household for decades. The elderly maid's lined face showed no surprise at what had transpired, only a grim satisfaction that suggested she had been expecting something of the sort. "Come, my lady," Marta said, taking Isolde's arm with gentle firmness. "Lord Edric has ordered you confined to your chambers until he decides what is to be done." As they walked through corridors suddenly filled with running guards and frightened servants, Marta leaned close to whisper words meant only for Isolde's ears. "The old stories my grandmother told were not stories at all, my lady. They were warnings and promises, passed down through generations of women who served houses that remembered the old ways." Isolde felt her pulse quicken. "What do you know of this, Alaric?" "I know that some debts are written in blood and starlight, and some protections span centuries," Marta replied cryptically. "I know that your bloodline carries obligations and privileges that run deeper than mortal law. And I know that what happened today was always meant to happen. When the time was right, and the need was great enough." They reached Isolde's tower chamber, a circular room high above the keep's main buildings that had become as much prison as refuge over the past 3 years. Marta helped her mistress settle into the chair beside the narrow window, then moved to light candles against the gathering dusk, with hands that showed no tremor despite her advanced age. "Tell me about the bloodline," Isolde said once they were alone and the door was barred from within. "Tell me what you know that I do not." Marta was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant, as if looking back through decades of carefully kept secrets. "Your great-great-grandmother, Lady Morwen, was not like other women of her time. She had what the old folk called the sight, the ability to perceive things that exist beyond the veil of common understanding. When she came to marry Lord Edric of Ravenshollow 3 centuries ago, she brought with her more than a dowry and political alliance." The old woman moved to a hidden panel in the stone wall that Isolde had never noticed before, pressing a sequence of stones that opened a concealed compartment. From within, she withdrew a leather-bound tome whose pages seemed to whisper as she turned them. "The Chronicle of Bloodlines," Marta explained, settling the ancient book on the table where candlelight could illuminate its faded text. Written in multiple hands across generations, recording pacts and agreements that mortal law does not recognize, but supernatural justice considers binding. Isolde leaned forward to examine the pages, noting that some passages were written in languages she did not recognize, while others seemed to shift and change even as she watched. What kind of pacts? Protection in exchange for service. Supernatural guardianship in return for certain considerations and acknowledgments. Your ancestor understood that some powers exist beyond the reach of crown and church, and she was wise enough to seek alliance rather than enmity with forces that could ensure her family's survival through dark times. As if responding to the proximity of the chronicle, the bloodstone pendant grew warmer against Isolde's throat. She touched it unconsciously, feeling the familiar pulse that now seemed to carry messages she was only beginning to understand. The vampire Alaric, he claimed, to be bound by these ancient oaths? Not claimed, my lady, he is bound, as surely as iron chains might hold a mortal man. The difference is that his bonds were forged willingly, sealed with ceremonies that join honor to obligation across the span of centuries. He has watched over your family line for 300 years, sometimes from great distance, sometimes from closer than you might imagine. Marta turned several pages in the chronicle, stopping at an illustration that made Isolde gasp. The image showed a tall figure in dark clothing, kneeling before a woman whose face bore a striking resemblance to Isolde herself. Between them lay a silver chalice and a dagger whose blade gleamed with supernatural light. Lady Morwen and Lord Alaric at the oath-swearing ceremony, Marta explained. She was facing a marriage to a cruel man who would have destroyed her and any children she might bear. Alaric offered protection in exchange for acknowledgement of his rightful place as guardian of her bloodline. The pact has passed from mother to daughter ever since, though knowledge of its exact terms has been carefully preserved. Meanwhile, in the great hall below, Father Benedict had remained after the other witnesses dispersed. He knelt before the altar that had, quote, "We've been brought in for the trial, ostensibly in prayer, but actually examining the silver ring that Alaric had left behind." The raven crest was carved with a skill that spoke of master craftsmanship, but more disturbing were the symbols etched around the band's inner surface marks that seemed familiar from half-remembered texts the church had declared heretical. His fingers trembled as he recognized fragments of the old language, words of binding and protection that predated Christianity's arrival in these northern lands. The ring was warm to the touch, almost alive with contained energy that made his palms sweat and his heart race. Whatever Alaric was, wherever he had come from, this token of his authority was undeniably real and impossibly ancient. Sir Gareth entered the hall as Father Benedict was returning the ring to its place on the evidence table. The captain of the guard looked haggard, his face drawn with exhaustion and frustration. "No trace of him anywhere," Gareth reported, though both men had expected as much. "It's as if he simply stepped out of existence itself." "Perhaps he did," Father Benedict replied quietly. "Perhaps what we witnessed today was a glimpse into truths that our comfortable certainties have blinded us to." Gareth studied the priest's face, noting the troubled expression that spoke of faith being tested by experiences that defied rational explanation. "What do you make of his claims about protection and ancient oaths?" "I make of them that power takes many forms, and justice is not always served through channels that mortal authority recognizes or controls." Father Benedict's voice carried weight of careful consideration. "I have studied the histories of this region, Captain. There are gaps in the records, periods when different laws held sway and different powers ruled these lands. Perhaps some of those powers never truly departed. As night fell over Raven's hollow keep, the very stones seemed to hold their breath in anticipation of what was to come." Isolde sat alone in her tower chamber, having dismissed Marta after hours of studying the Chronicle of Bloodlines. The ancient tome lay open on the table before her, its pages illuminated by candlelight that cast dancing shadows across text that seemed to move and shift when she was not looking directly at it. The bloodstone pendant had grown so warm it was almost uncomfortable against her skin, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat but seemed to anticipate each beat by a fraction of a second. She found herself touching it frequently, drawn by an instinct she could not name to maintain contact with the strange warmth it provided. A whisper of air stirred the candle flames, though no window was open and no door had moved. Isolde looked up from the chronicle to find she was no longer alone. Alaric stood beside the narrow window, his dark figure framed against the star-filled sky beyond. He had not entered through any visible means. He was simply there, as if the shadows themselves had taken form and substance. "You are not afraid," he observed, his voice carrying notes of both surprise and approval. "Should I be?" Isolde asked, closing the chronicle carefully but keeping her hand resting on its leather cover. "You came to my defense when no one else would. You offered protection when I had none." Alaric moved away from the window with fluid grace, each step deliberate and controlled. In the candlelight, his features were sharp and elegant, bearing the kind of masculine beauty that spoke of noble bloodlines and centuries of refined breeding. Yet, there was something predatory in the way he moved, a reminder that beauty and danger often walked hand in hand. "Fear would be wise," he said, settling into the chair across from her, with movements too smooth and controlled for any mortal man. "I am not human, Lady Isolde. What I offer comes with prices that mortals do not easily pay. What you offer is freedom from cruelty and the protection of ancient law," she replied, meeting his gaze directly. "The price cannot be worse than what I have already endured." Alaric studied her face in the flickering light, noting the strength that had emerged from suffering and the intelligence that had survived despite systematic attempts to crush it. "Your ancestor understood the weight of the bargain she made. She knew that accepting supernatural protection meant acknowledging supernatural authority in matters that mortal law could not address." "Tell me about the pact," Isolde said. "Help me understand what I have inherited. 3 centuries ago, your great-great-grandmother faced a choice between submission and destruction. Lord Edric's ancestor was not the first of his line to believe that wives existed solely for their convenience and pleasure. Lady Morwen was strong-willed and intelligent, qualities that her husband saw as defects to be corrected through violence and isolation. Alaric's eyes grew distant as he reached back through centuries of memory. "I had ruled these lands in secret for decades, maintaining the balance between mortal ambition and supernatural justice. When Lady Morwen's suffering became unbearable, she sought me out and proposed an alliance, protection for her and her female descendants in exchange for acknowledgement of my authority and certain considerations." "What kind of considerations?" "Blood, freely given, but not in the way that legends suggest. A few drops at the dark of each moon, offered willingly as payment for services rendered. Information about threats that mortal eyes might miss, but supernatural senses could detect. And most importantly, the understanding that some forms of justice exist beyond the reach of crown and church." Isolde felt the pendant pulse against her throat, as if responding to his words with approval or recognition. "And this pact passes from mother to daughter, to the eldest daughter of the bloodline, when she comes of age or faces circumstances that require supernatural intervention." Alaric leaned forward slightly, his ancient eyes holding hers with intensity that made her breath catch. "The choice is always freely made. No woman of your line has ever been compelled to accept what is offered. But if I refuse, then you face your troubles alone, as mortals have always done. The pact ends with your rejection, and your children will be born free of both its protections and its obligations." The weight of the decision settled over Isolde like a heavy cloak. Outside her window, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of winter storms to come. Inside the chamber, the candle flames burned steadily, as if the supernatural presence of her visitor had stilled even the natural movement of air. "There is something else you should know," Alaric continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Your marriage to Lord Edric may not be as binding as he believes." Isolde straightened in her chair, her pulse quickening with something that might have been hope. "What do you mean?" The original pact included specific provisions regarding marriage contracts within the protected bloodline. No union could be considered valid without the consent of the supernatural guardian as well as mortal authority. Lord Edric never sought such consent, which means I may not be legally bound to him at all. Isolde finished, her mind racing through the implications. Under supernatural law, which in these lands predates and supersedes mortal statute, you have been living under false constraints for 3 years. Meanwhile, in the depths of the keep, Sir Gareth was making a discovery that would change his understanding of Ravenshallow's history forever. Following rumors of strange sounds in the lower levels, he had descended to the ancient foundations that most inhabitants avoided. There, hidden beneath the altar of the keep's original chapel, he found a ceremonial dagger whose blade gleamed with moonlight despite being deep underground. The moonstone dagger was a thing of supernatural beauty, its handle carved from white stone that seemed to glow with inner light. Along the blade, symbols were etched in the same script he had seen on Alaric's ring, words that hurt to look at directly, but seemed to whisper of power and protection. The weapon was old beyond measure, yet perfectly preserved, as if time itself had chosen to leave it untouched. As his fingers closed around the handle, Gareth felt a shock of recognition run through his body. Images flashed through his mind, ceremonies conducted in starlight, oaths sworn in blood and silver, and the faces of his own ancestors participating in rites that the church would have condemned as heretical. His family had not always served as mere guards and soldiers. They had once been participants in the supernatural agreements that governed these lands. Back in Lord Edric's private chambers, the master of Ravenshallow was discovering that supernatural harassment could take forms more subtle than dramatic confrontations. His wine turned bitter on his tongue, his fires provided no warmth despite blazing high, and every shadow seemed to move independently of the objects that cast them. Servants reported strange sounds in the corridors at night, and horses in the stable refused to eat or allow themselves to be ridden. More disturbing were the dreams that plagued his sleep visions of ancient lords who stood in judgment of his actions, their faces bearing the terrible authority of those who had ruled through supernatural mandate rather than mere political power. In these dreams, he stood before tribunals that recognized no mortal law, accused of crimes against bonds that he had never known existed, but was somehow bound to honor. The political ramifications of the day's events were already spreading beyond the keep's walls. Riders had been dispatched to neighboring lords, carrying carefully worded messages that spoke of supernatural intervention in mortal affairs. Some recipients would dismiss such reports as hysteria or political maneuvering, but others would remember their own family stories of powers that walked between the mortal and divine realms. As the night deepened and the wind howled around the ancient towers, Isolde felt herself standing at a crossroads that would determine not only her own fate, but the balance of power between worlds. The choice Alaric offered was freedom. But freedom always came with responsibilities that comfortable captivity did not require. The bloodstone pendant pulsed against her throat like a second heart, warm with the accumulated magic of centuries and bright with the promise of power that she was only beginning to understand. The first sign that Alaric's intervention had rippled beyond Ravenshallow Keep came 3 days later, when riders began appearing on the horizon bearing messages and requests for audience. Word of supernatural events traveled faster than horses could carry it, spreading through the network of alliances and enmities that connected the northern lords like invisible threads across a vast web. Lord Edric stood at the window of his private chamber, watching yet another delegation approach the gates. His face bore the haggard marks of sleepless nights and the kind of paranoia that came from fighting enemies that could not be seen or touched. The wine cup in his hand trembled slightly, and dark circles beneath his eyes spoke of dreams that brought no rest. Another message from Lord Brennan. announced Sir Gareth as he entered the chamber, carrying a sealed parchment that bore the raven seal of a neighbouring house. He requests clarification regarding yesterday's reports of unusual occurrences. Edric snatched the message with more force than necessary, breaking the wax seal with his thumbnail and scanning the carefully worded text. Lord Brennan was a cautious man who had survived 3 decades of northern politics by avoiding commitments until he understood all the variables involved. His letter was a masterwork of diplomatic language that managed to ask probing questions while revealing nothing of the writer's own position. "They circle like carrion birds," Edric muttered, crushing the parchment in his fist. "Seeking advantage from what they see as weakness." "Perhaps, my lord," Gareth replied carefully. "They seek understanding rather than opportunity. The events of recent days have implications that extend beyond our borders." Edric turned from the window with the sharp movement of a man whose nerves had been stretched to their breaking point. "Implications? A madman appeared in my hall, spouting ancient nonsense, and disappeared like morning mist. There are no implications beyond the need to maintain order and punish those who would disrupt lawful authority." Yet even as he spoke, Edric knew his words rang hollow. The supernatural harassment had intensified each night since Alaric's warning, taking forms that defied rational explanation. His food spoiled at the first bite, his fires provided no warmth, and shadows moved independently throughout the keep. Servants whispered of spectral figures walking the corridors, and livestock refused to eat or breed. Most disturbing were the messages that appeared written in frost on his chamber windows each morning, words in a script he could not read but somehow understood. They spoke of judgment and consequence, of debts that would be collected and justice that would be served. No matter how many times he had the windows cleaned, the messages returned with the dawn. Sir Gareth had been conducting his own investigation into the keep's supernatural history, guided by the moonstone dagger he had discovered beneath the chapel altar. The weapon seemed to respond to his touch with warmth and subtle vibration, as if recognizing something in his bloodline that he himself was only beginning to understand. Hidden in his private quarters, Gareth studied documents he had found in sealed chambers that most inhabitants of the keep never knew existed. Maps drawn in silver ink showed ley lines of power that ran beneath the northern territories like veins of supernatural energy. Treaties written in multiple languages detailed agreements between mortal lords and beings whose nature transcended human understanding. His own family name appeared repeatedly in these ancient records, always in contexts that spoke of service and loyalty to powers greater than crown or church. The Gareth lineage had not always been mere soldiers. They had once been guardians of supernatural law, bound by oaths that spanned generations and sealed with ceremonies that modern minds would dismiss as primitive superstition. The moonstone dagger had awakened memories that felt more like inherited knowledge than personal experience. He could recall, though he had never learned the proper forms for addressing supernatural beings, the protocols for negotiating between mortal and immortal interests, and the signs that indicated when ancient compacts were being invoked. Meanwhile, in the forest surrounding Ravenshollow Keep, other figures were gathering in response to signals that only supernatural senses could detect. They came from great distances, traveling by means that left no tracks and following summons that echoed through dimensions parallel to the mortal realm. Each carried a black obsidian pendant known as the Raven's Eye Amulet, tokens that allowed communication across vast spaces and instant recognition among members of Alaric's extended network. The vampires who answered his call were not the mindless monsters of peasant folklore, but ancient beings of great power and subtle intelligence who had learned to balance their supernatural nature with the complexities of existing alongside mortal civilization. They had walked among humans for centuries, sometimes as protectors, sometimes as judges, always as forces that represented justice beyond the reach of mortal law. Elizabeth arrived first, a woman whose apparent youth concealed centuries of experience in matters both political and supernatural. Her dark hair was braided with silver threads that caught starlight even in the depths of the forest, and her movements carried the fluid grace of someone who had long ago transcended the limitations of mortal flesh. "The compact has been invoked," she said as Alaric emerged from shadows that seemed deeper than natural darkness should allow. "Word has spread through our kind that the old agreements are being honored once again." "And what is the consensus among our people?" Alaric asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "That mortal arrogance has gone unchecked for too long, and that an example must be made to remind them of powers they have chosen to forget." Elizabeth's voice carried the weight of accumulated years and the authority of one who had seen empires rise and fall. "Some advocate for direct action. Others counsel patience and careful maneuvering. And you? I counsel that justice delayed is justice denied, but that justice served rashly often creates more problems than it solves." She paused, studying his face in the starlight. "The girl, Lady Isolde, she has accepted the protection. She is considering it. The choice must be freely made, as our laws require." "Even if her refusal means continued suffering under mortal law?" "Even so. Coercion invalidates consent, and consent is the foundation upon which all legitimate supernatural authority rests." Other figures emerged from the darkness as they spoke, Marcus, whose scholarly demeanor concealed a mind that had catalogued centuries of human folly. Diana, whose warrior's bearing spoke of battles fought in defense of supernatural law, and Thomas, youngest among them but old enough to have witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms. Each carried stories of mortal lords who had forgotten the old ways, breaking compacts their ancestors had sealed in blood and starlight. Some had been reminded through gentle persuasion, others through demonstrations of power that left lasting impressions on both transgressor and witness. A few had required more permanent solutions. "What of the political ramifications?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to thinking in terms of decades rather than years. "Mortal authorities will not ignore such direct intervention in their affairs. Mortal authorities have been ignoring supernatural law for generations," Alaric replied. "Perhaps it is time they were reminded that some forms of justice operate beyond their understanding or control." Back in the keep, Isolde was discovering that accepting supernatural protection came with abilities she had never imagined possessing. The bloodstone pendant had grown warm to the topic space, particular side of point where its heat spread through her entire body, awakening senses that mortal flesh was not meant to contain. She found herself able to hear conversations taking place in distant parts of the keep, her enhanced perception carrying words through stone walls as if they were spoken in her presence. The thoughts and emotions of those around her pressed against her consciousness like whispered secrets, revealing the true feelings hidden behind polite facades. Most startling was her growing awareness of the supernatural activity gathering around Raven's Hollow. She could sense the presence of beings whose nature transcended mortality, feel the weight of their attention like pressure against her skin. The realization that she stood at the center of forces beyond human comprehension was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Father Benedict had spent the days since Alaric's appearance in deep study of texts that the church hierarchy preferred to keep locked away from common view. Ancient Gospels spoke of powers that walked the earth before the coming of Christ, beings of divine origin who had established their own forms of justice and protection for those who sought their aid. The priest found himself facing a crisis of faith that challenged everything he had believed about the nature of divine authority and supernatural intervention. If powers existed that operated outside church doctrine, what did that say about the completeness of Christian truth? Yet, if those powers served justice and protected the innocent, how could they be condemned as evil? The arrival of Inquisitor Cornelius at Ravenshollow Keep marked a turning point that would transform supernatural intervention from personal protection to open conflict between ancient powers and institutional authority. The Church's representative came not as a simple priest, but as a specialist in hunting beings that existed beyond mortal understanding, armed with knowledge that had been accumulated through centuries of systematic persecution. Lord Edric greeted the Inquisitor with barely concealed desperation, seeing in the Church's intervention a chance to reclaim authority that supernatural forces had undermined. Cornelius was a tall, lean man whose ascetic appearance concealed both physical strength and intellectual cunning. His grey robes bore symbols that hurt to look at directly, and the leather case he carried contained instruments whose purpose was better left unexplored. "You have done well to contact the Church regarding these irregularities," Cornelius said as he settled into the chair opposite Edric's desk. His voice carried the flat certainty of someone who had never questioned his own righteousness. Supernatural incursions require immediate and decisive response before they can establish permanent footholds in Christian lands. "Can you deal with this creature that has threatened my household?" Edric asked, leaning forward with hungry intensity. "Can you remove this, Alaric, and restore proper order to my domain?" "I can do more than remove him," the Inquisitor replied, opening his leather case to reveal silver instruments that gleamed with unnatural light. "I can ensure that his kind never again dares to interfere with lawful Christian authority in this region." The weapons Cornelius displayed were not mere tools, but artifacts of supernatural warfare, blessed and cursed through rituals that predated the official church hierarchy. Silver-bladed daggers inscribed with prayers in dead languages, crossbow bolts tipped with blessed iron, and most disturbing of all, a crystal vial filled with liquid that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Holy water blessed by saints who died for the faith," Cornelius explained, noting Edric's fascination with the vial. "But not the simple blessed water used in common ceremonies. This has been sanctified through processes that transform it into a weapon capable of destroying even the most powerful supernatural entities." What the Inquisitor did not reveal was his true agenda, which extended far beyond simple protection of Christian authority. The organization he served had been collecting supernatural beings for decades, studying them, experimenting on them, and seeking to harness their powers for purposes that the church hierarchy would never officially sanction. In the hidden vaults beneath distant monasteries, creatures of immense power languished in specially designed prisons, their supernatural abilities slowly drained away to fuel rituals that granted their captors extended life and enhanced abilities. Cornelius saw in Alaric not just a threat to be eliminated, but a prize to be captured and exploited. Meanwhile, in the depths of the keep's foundations, Marta was conducting ceremonies that had been passed down through generations of women who served as bridges between mortal and supernatural worlds. The blood chalice of binding, hidden for 3 centuries in chambers that existed on maps drawn in silver ink, was finally being brought forth from its place of concealment. The chalice was a thing of terrible beauty, crafted from silver that had been mined in moonlight, and shaped by hands that understood the malleable nature of supernatural law. Its surface was covered with engravings that seemed to move in candlelight, depicting scenes of oath-making and covenant sealing that spanned the centuries since its creation. Marta's fingers trembled as she prepared the ritual space, according to traditions that her grandmother had taught her in whispered conversations conducted in the hours before dawn. Candles made from wax that had never known sunlight were arranged in patterns that opened doorways between dimensions, and words in the old language were spoken to summon powers that slept beneath the foundations of the modern world. The chalice would be needed soon, for the supernatural compact that protected Isolde's bloodline could be either renewed or broken through ceremonies that required willing participation from all parties bound by the original agreement. If Isolde chose to accept Alaric's protection, the chalice would seal that choice with bonds stronger than mortal law. If she chose freedom from supernatural obligation, the same chalice would release her from debts inherited through blood and birth. Sir Gareth was experiencing his own awakening as knowledge inherited through bloodline began to surface in his conscious mind. The moonstone dagger had become his constant companion, its presence awakening memories that belonged to ancestors who had served supernatural law when it ruled these lands openly rather than from shadows. He found himself able to perceive the supernatural tensions building around the keep like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. The very air crackled with energy that made his teeth ache and his sword hand twitch, while his enhanced senses detected the approach of beings whose nature transcended mortal understanding. More troubling was his growing awareness that his oath of service to Lord Edric conflicted with deeper loyalties that ran in his blood like inherited disease. His family had once sworn binding oaths to serve the supernatural guardians of these lands, agreements that superseded later commitments to mortal lords who had forgotten the true source of their authority. The political situation surrounding Ravenshollow had become increasingly complex, as neighbouring lords received reports of supernatural intervention and began choosing sides in a conflict that most of them did not fully understand. Some saw opportunity in Edric's apparent weakness, sending messages that hinted at support for any claims that might emerge from the chaos. Others remembered their own family stories of ancient compacts and began taking defensive measures against powers they hoped never to confront directly. Lord Brennan had called a gathering of the Northern Lords, ostensibly to discuss trade agreements, but actually to address the supernatural crisis that threatened to destabilize the entire region. The invitation list included names that carried weight in both mortal and supernatural circles, men whose families had maintained careful neutrality in conflicts between ancient powers and modern authority. Isolde spent her days in the tower chamber that had become both prison and sanctuary, studying the chronicle of bloodlines and feeling the supernatural abilities that grew stronger with each passing hour. The bloodstone pendant had become so warm that it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and through it she could sense the gathering storm of forces that would soon converge on Ravenshollow Keep. Her enhanced perception allowed her to overhear conversations taking place throughout the keep, and what she learned filled her with both hope and terror. The Inquisitor's arrival meant that the conflict would soon escalate beyond supernatural harassment to open warfare between ancient powers and institutional authority. Yet it also meant that the choice she faced was no longer merely personal but political, with implications that would affect every supernatural being in the Northern Territories. Most disturbing were the glimpses she caught of Cornelius's true nature through her growing telepathic abilities. The man wore righteousness like a mask, but beneath it lurked ambitions that had more to do with personal power than divine service. His thoughts carried images of creatures imprisoned in underground chambers, their supernatural essence slowly extracted through processes that made medieval torture seem merciful by comparison. Alaric appeared to her again as darkness fell, materializing from shadows that seemed deeper than natural night should allow. His presence filled the chamber with energy that made the candle flames burn brighter and steadier, and the bloodstone pendant grew so warm it was almost uncomfortable against her skin. "The choice can be delayed no longer," he said without preamble. "Forces are converging that will transform this personal matter into a conflict that spans kingdoms. If you choose to accept the protection, it must be now, before events spiral beyond anyone's ability to control. And if I choose freedom from supernatural obligation, then you face what comes alone, as mortal women have always done, but understand that your choice affects more than your own fate." Others have committed themselves to your protection based on the assumption that ancient compacts will be honored. Isolde rose from her chair and moved to the window, looking out over lands that seemed peaceful in moonlight, but crackled with supernatural tension that her enhanced senses could detect. What will happen to those who have served my bloodline faithfully? They will find other purposes, other ways to honor the oaths that bind them. Supernatural law does not punish servants for the choices of those they were sworn to protect. The weight of decision pressed down on her like the stone walls of the keep itself, heavy with centuries of accumulated obligation and expectation. Outside her window, the wind carried whispers of gathering forces that would reshape the balance between ancient power and modern authority, with her choice as the fulcrum on which everything would turn. The revelation that would shatter everything Isolde thought she understood about her marriage and her captivity came not from Alaric or the ancient chronicles, but from Marta's trembling hands as she withdrew a document from the deepest recesses of the hidden chamber. The parchment was older than the marriage contract that bound Isolde to Edric, written in multiple languages and sealed with wax that bore impressions of both mortal and supernatural authority. "The true marriage contract," Marta whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that howled around the tower. "The original agreement that should have governed your union, written according to laws that predate mortal statute and supersede earthly authority." Isolde took the document with hands that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. The text was written in the common tongue, but interwoven with passages in the old language that seemed to shimmer and move in the candlelight. As she read, the implications of what she was discovering sent waves of shock and hope coursing through her body. According to supernatural law, she read aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word, "No union between members of protected bloodlines shall be considered valid without the explicit consent of appointed guardians. Such consent must be freely given and publicly acknowledged before the ceremony can be considered binding under laws both mortal and divine." The bloodstone pendant grew so warm it was almost painful against her skin, pulsing with energy that seemed to respond to the revelation of truth long concealed. Marta nodded gravely, her lined face reflecting decades of carefully guarded knowledge finally brought to light. "Lord Edric never sought supernatural consent for your marriage," the old woman explained. "He treated it as a purely political arrangement, ignoring the requirements that govern unions within bloodlines bound by ancient compact. Under the law that truly matters in these lands, you have never been legally married to him at all." The full weight of this discovery settled over Isolde like dawn breaking after the longest night. 3 years of submission, of accepting abuse as the natural consequence of wifely duty, of believing herself trapped by bonds that could not be broken, all of it based on a legal fiction that supernatural law refused to recognize. "But why was I never told?" she demanded, anger beginning to burn alongside hope in her chest. "Why did you allow me to suffer for 3 years under false constraints?" "Because the knowledge would have meant nothing without the power to act upon it," Marta replied sadly. "Supernatural law exists, child, but it requires supernatural enforcement. Without Alaric's intervention, the truth would have been merely academic, a comfort that changed nothing about your daily reality." Meanwhile, in the keep's great hall, Sir Gareth was making a discovery that would force him to choose between oaths that could no longer coexist. Hidden behind a loose stone in the wall, he had found documents that revealed the true nature of his family's service to Ravenshollow Keep. The Gareth lineage had not always been mere soldiers, serving whoever held political power. They had been supernatural guardians, bound by blood oaths to protect the ancient compacts that governed these lands. The moonstone dagger had led him to this revelation, its supernatural properties responding to his touch by revealing secrets that mundane investigation could never have uncovered. As his fingers traced the carved symbols on the weapon's handle, memories that belonged to his ancestors, flooded his consciousness like water breaking through a dam. His great-grandfather had stood witness when Lady Morwen and Lord Alaric sealed their supernatural compact 3 centuries ago. His grandfather had served as intermediary between mortal and immortal powers, ensuring that the delicate balance between worlds remained stable. His own father had died defending supernatural law against mortal lords who sought to break ancient agreements for political advantage. The realization that he had spent years serving the very forces his bloodline was sworn to oppose filled Gareth with shame and determination in equal measure. His oath to Lord Edric was meaningless compared to the deeper obligations that ran in his blood like inherited destiny. The time had come to remember his true purpose and reclaim the authority that supernatural law granted to his family line. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come, emerging from an investigation that Inquisitor Cornelius believed was proceeding in secret. His examination of Lord Edric had revealed something that changed the entire nature of the conflict. The source of Edric's increasing paranoia and violence was not natural cruelty, but supernatural influence of the darkest kind. Hidden among Edric's personal possessions, Cornelius discovered an amulet that radiated malevolent energy strong enough to make his blessed silver instruments grow warm with responsive power. The artifact was crude compared to the sophisticated supernatural items used by beings like Alaric, but its purpose was unmistakable to amplify negative emotions and drive the wearer toward increasingly destructive behavior. "Where did you acquire this?" the Inquisitor demanded, holding the cursed amulet with tongs blessed in holy water. Edric stared at the object with the blank expression of someone emerging from a long fever dream. I found it among my father's effects after his death. He said it was a family heirloom, passed down through generations of our line." The Inquisitor's eyes narrowed as he examined the artifact more closely. The symbols carved into its surface were not the elegant script used in legitimate supernatural compacts, but the crude markings associated with entities that existed in opposition to both divine and infernal authority. This was not the work of vampires or other organized supernatural beings, but of something far darker and more chaotic. "This is not a family heirloom," Cornelius said grimly. "This is a focus for malevolent entities that feed on human suffering and discord. It has been influencing your thoughts and emotions, driving you toward acts that serve its creator's purposes rather than your own." As the cursed influence lifted from his mind, Edric experienced a moment of terrible clarity. He remembered the man he had been before the amulet's influence took hold, recalled the genuine affection he had felt for Isolde during their courtship. The 3 years of cruelty and paranoia seemed like memories belonging to someone else, actions taken by a stranger, wearing his face. "What have I done?" he whispered, the words carrying the weight of dawning horror at his own actions. But Cornelius's attention was focused on implications that extended far beyond one lord's personal redemption. If malevolent entities were actively working to destabilize the region through supernatural influence, then the situation was far more complex than a simple conflict between ancient compacts and modern authority. Someone or something was orchestrating events for purposes that served neither mortal nor legitimate supernatural interests. "There are forces at work here that neither your local vampire nor the church hierarchy fully comprehend," the Inquisitor said, his voice carrying new respect for the complexity of the situation. "This amulet is one of several I have encountered in recent years, always in the possession of lords whose behavior has become increasingly erratic and destructive." The implications were staggering. If influential nobles throughout the region were being manipulated by dark supernatural forces, then the political instability of recent years might not be natural consequence of competing ambitions, but orchestrated chaos designed to weaken both mortal and supernatural authority. Alaric materialized in Isolde's chamber as she was absorbing the revelation about her marriage's invalidity, his presence bringing with it an aura of ancient power that made the very air vibrate with contained energy. But when she told him what Marta had revealed, his reaction was not the satisfaction she had expected, but profound concern. "If your marriage was never valid under supernatural law," he said slowly, "then the protections extended to you as Edric's wife were also invalid. You have been vulnerable to forces that I believed were held at bay by legal barriers." "What kind of forces?" "The same entities that have been influencing your husband's behavior through cursed artifacts," Alaric replied grimly. "We believed that supernatural law protected you even within an unwanted marriage, but if the marriage itself was illegitimate," he stopped speaking as the implications settled over both of them like a physical weight. The bloodstone pendant, which had been growing warmer over the past weeks, suddenly blazed with heat that made Isolde gasp and clutch at her throat. "They know," she whispered, understanding flowing through her enhanced perceptions like ice water in her veins. "Whatever has been working against us, they know that I am no longer protected by the legal barriers they believed were in place. Outside the keep's walls, supernatural senses detected the approaching presence of beings whose nature was darker and more chaotic than anything that had yet revealed itself. The careful balance between mortal and supernatural law that had governed the region for centuries was collapsing, and in the resulting chaos, entities that thrived on discord and suffering were moving to claim territory that had long been denied to them. The revelation that Isolde's marriage was invalid had freed her from mortal constraints, but it had also exposed her to supernatural dangers that organized powers like Alaric's network had spent centuries keeping at bay. The choice she faced was no longer simply between supernatural protection and mortal freedom, but between accepting ancient guardianship and facing enemies that neither mortal law nor individual strength could hope to overcome. As the wind around Ravenshollow Keep began to carry voices that spoke in languages predating human civilization, Isolde realized that the personal crisis that had begun with domestic abuse had escalated into something that threatened the very foundations of the supernatural order that protected the mortal world from forces it was not equipped to understand or resist. The true enemy was finally revealing itself, and neither mortal authority nor ancient compact might be sufficient to stand against what was coming. The discovery that malevolent entities had been orchestrating chaos throughout the northern territories transformed what had begun as a personal conflict into a supernatural war that would determine the balance of power between order and chaos for generations to come. In the hidden chambers beneath Ravenshollow Keep, allies from both mortal and immortal realms gathered to prepare for a confrontation that would test the very foundations of the ancient compacts that governed their world. Alaric stood before a war council unlike any that had convened in 3 centuries, its membership spanning the divide between mortal and supernatural authority in ways that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. Elizabeth and the other vampires who had answered his call occupied one side of the ancient chamber, their pale faces reflecting candlelight with an ethereal glow that spoke of power barely contained within forms that merely appeared human. Across from them sat Sir Gareth, no longer conflicted about his loyalties, but fully embracing his family's role as guardians of supernatural law. The moonstone dagger lay on the table before him, its blade pulsing with soft light that provided illumination beyond what mere candles could offer. Beside him, Father Benedict represented the complex relationship between church doctrine and supernatural reality, his presence acknowledging truths that official theology preferred to deny. The cursed amulets have been discovered in the possession of 7 lords across the northern territories, Alaric reported, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated intelligence gathered by supernatural means. Each has shown the same pattern: increasing paranoia, violence toward family members, and political decisions that serve no rational interest but create maximum instability. Elizabeth leaned forward, her ancient eyes reflecting. Knowledge earned through centuries of dealing with entities that existed in opposition to organized supernatural authority. These are not random artifacts, but components of a coordinated campaign. Someone or something is working systematically to weaken both mortal and supernatural law in preparation for a larger incursion. Can you identify the source? Father Benedict asked, his weathered hands clasped tightly around his prayer book as he struggled to reconcile his faith with the reality of supernatural warfare. The entities behind this campaign exist in the spaces between organized power structures, Marcus replied from his position near the chamber's ancient maps. They are neither divine nor infernal in the classical sense, but chaotic forces that feed on discord and thrive in the absence of stable authority. The political implications were staggering. If supernatural chaos entities had been manipulating influential nobles for years, then every alliance, every trade, agreement, every military decision made during that time was suspect. The careful balance of power that had maintained peace in the region was built on foundations that might be entirely corrupt. Sir Gareth spread out documents he had recovered from his family's hidden archives, charts and treaties that detailed the supernatural geography of the northern lands. According to these records, the entities we face require anchor points in the mortal realm to maintain their influence. The cursed amulets serve that purpose, but they also represent vulnerability. Vulnerability how? Alaric asked, studying the ancient maps with interest that reflected both tactical consideration and personal concern for the woman whose fate had become intertwined with the larger conflict. If we can simultaneously destroy all the anchor points, the entities lose their ability to maintain coherent presence in our reality, Gareth explained. But the timing must be precise. If even one amulet remains, active when the others are destroyed, the surviving entity will absorb the power that would have been distributed among the group. Meanwhile, in the keep's highest tower, Isolde was undergoing a transformation that would prepare her for the role she would need to play in the coming confrontation. The bloodstone pendant had grown so warm it was painful to touch, but she could not bring herself to remove it. Through the ancient artifact, supernatural knowledge flowed into her consciousness like water filling a previously empty vessel. Marta guided her through exercises that awakened abilities inherited through bloodline, but dormant until the proper circumstances aligned to allow their manifestation. Isolde found herself able to perceive supernatural energies as colored light that flowed through the keep like visible rivers, revealing the presence and nature of beings that existed beyond mortal perception. The pendant connects you to every woman of your bloodline who wore it before, Marta explained as Isolde struggled to process the overwhelming flood of sensation and memory. Their knowledge, their strength, their sacrifices, all of it becomes available to you when the need is great enough. The experiences were disorienting and profound. Isolde found herself remembering conversations she had never participated in, walking through landscapes she had never visited, and understanding languages she had never learned. Her great-great-grandmother's memories of the original compact ceremony flowed through her consciousness, providing insight into the true nature of the agreements that bound mortal and supernatural realms together. But the knowledge came with a terrible price. The more fully she embraced her supernatural heritage, the further she moved from the purely human existence she had known. Each ability that manifested, each memory that surfaced, each perception that expanded beyond mortal limits carried her deeper into a realm where the ordinary concerns of human life held less meaning. In his private chambers, Lord Edric was experiencing his own form of preparation for the coming conflict. Free from the cursed amulet's influence for the first time in years, he was forced to confront the full scope of his actions and their consequences. The man who emerged from supernatural manipulation bore little resemblance to the cruel tyrant who had terrorized his household and threatened neighboring lords. Inquisitor Cornelius observed this transformation with professional interest, noting the speed with which Edric's personality reverted to its original form once the malevolent influence was removed. The implications for church doctrine regarding sin and redemption were profound, but such theological considerations would have to wait until the immediate supernatural crisis was resolved. "Can you remember anything about how you acquired the amulet?" Cornelius asked, his tone suggesting clinical inquiry rather than personal judgment. "Any details about its origin or the circumstances of its discovery?" Edric closed his eyes, struggling to separate genuine memory from the false recollections that supernatural influence had implanted in his mind. "There was a merchant," he said slowly, "claiming to represent my father's estate. He said the amulet had belonged to our family for generations, that my father had specifically requested it be delivered to me after his death. Can you describe this merchant? Tall, well-dressed, with eyes that—" Edric stopped, his face growing pale as suppressed memories began to surface. "With eyes that seemed to reflect more light than they should have been able to catch, and his shadow fell the wrong way, regardless of where the light was coming from." Cornelius nodded grimly. Supernatural entities attempting to operate in the mortal realm often betrayed their true nature through such inconsistencies, signs that trained observers could detect if they knew what to look for. The merchant had clearly been something other than human, possibly one of the chaos entities themselves, or a mortal agent corrupted beyond recognition. The crown of shadows waited in the deepest vault beneath the keep, a relic of Alaric's mortal rule that he had hidden away centuries ago when he first embraced his supernatural nature. The ancient circlet was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, crafted from silver mined in moonlight and set with gems that captured and reflected supernatural energy in patterns that hurt mortal eyes to perceive directly. Elizabeth studied the crown with deep concern, understanding both its power and its terrible cost. "Using this artifact would amplify your abilities beyond anything you have experienced in centuries of supernatural existence," she warned. "But the price is everything that remains of my humanity," Alaric replied quietly. "I know what accepting the crown's power would mean. The question is whether the situation justifies that sacrifice." "There might be another way," Sir Gareth interjected, his hand resting on the moonstone dagger's handle. "The Guardian bloodlines were created specifically to provide alternatives to such extremes. If Lady Isolde fully accepts her supernatural heritage, the combined power of vampire lord and awakened guardian might be sufficient without requiring you to sacrifice your essential nature." The chamber fell silent as the implications settled over the assembled allies. Everything would depend on choices yet to be made and powers yet to be fully manifested. The fate of the supernatural order that protected the mortal world from chaotic forces would rest on the willingness of individuals to accept responsibilities that would transform them beyond recognition. Outside the keep's walls, supernatural senses detected the gathering of malevolent entities drawn by the approaching confrontation. They came not as organized army but as chaotic swarm, beings of hunger and discord, whose only unity lay in their shared desire to tear down the structures that limited their influence in the mortal realm. Father Benedict spent the hours before dawn in prayer that encompassed both Christian doctrine and older forms of spiritual communion that the Church officially denied but privately acknowledged. His faith had evolved beyond simple acceptance of institutional authority to embrace a more complex understanding of divine power that operated through multiple channels and served justice through means that dogma alone could not encompass. As the first light of dawn touched the ancient stones of Ravenshallow Keep, the supernatural allies completed their preparations for a confrontation that would determine whether order or chaos would govern the relationship between mortal and immortal realms. The personal conflict that had begun with domestic abuse had evolved into a test of fundamental principles that would reshape the hidden world for generations. to come. Isolde stood at her tower window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in colors that her enhanced vision revealed to contain patterns and meanings invisible to purely mortal perception. The bloodstone pendant pulsed against her throat with the accumulated power of centuries, and through it she could feel the approach of forces that would soon converge on the keep like storm winds gathering to test the strength of ancient foundations. The time for preparation was ending, and the time for choice was at hand. The attack came at dawn, when the boundary between night and day created gaps in the natural barriers that normally prevented chaotic entities from manifesting directly in the mortal realm. The great hall of Ravenshollow Keep became a battleground where supernatural forces clashed with an intensity that made the ancient stones themselves groan under the pressure of competing powers. Isolde stood at the center of the conflict, the bloodstone pendant blazing with heat that should have burned her flesh, but instead filled her with power that transcended anything she had imagined possible. Through the artifact's connection to her ancestral bloodline, she could perceive the battle unfolding on multiple levels. The physical confrontation visible to mortal eyes, and the deeper struggle between fundamental forces that determined the very nature of reality in the Northern Territories. Lord Edric, freed from the cursed amulet's influence, but haunted by years of actions he could barely remember authorizing, stood beside his former victim with a sword that trembled in his grasp. The transformation from supernatural puppet to remorseful ally had happened too quickly for complete psychological adjustment, but his determination to atone for past cruelties provided strength that mere martial skill could never have supplied. "They're not fully manifested yet," Sir Gareth called out over the otherworldly sounds that filled the hall as reality itself seemed to ripple and bend. The moonstone dagger in his hand blazed with silver light that cut through the darkness like a beacon of order in the chaos. "If we can disrupt their anchor points before they achieve complete presence." His words were cut off as the first of the chaos entities achieved sufficient coherence to interact directly with the mortal realm. The creature that emerged from the swirling darkness between dimensions bore no fixed form, shifting and flowing like liquid shadow, given hunger and malevolent intelligence. Where it touched the stone floor, frost spread in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Alaric moved to intercept the entity with fluid grace that spoke of centuries of supernatural combat experience. His enhanced speed and strength were impressive, but even his vampiric abilities seemed insufficient against beings that existed partially outside the natural laws that governed both mortal and traditional supernatural creatures. "The Shard of Dawn," Elizabeth called out, as she engaged a second manifestation with silver weapons blessed through rituals older than recorded history. "It's our only chance of permanent destruction rather than mere banishment." Father Benedict emerged from the shadows where he had been conducting a protective ritual, carrying a crystalline weapon that blazed with light, painful to supernatural eyes. The Shard of Dawn was a relic from the early days of the Church's conflict with chaotic forces, blessed by saints who had died defending the mortal realm from entities that served neither divine nor infernal masters. "Who among us is pure enough of heart to wield it effectively?" the priest asked, his voice barely audible over the supernatural storm that raged around them. The question hung in the air like a physical weight. The Shard of Dawn required not just supernatural power, but moral clarity that could focus its divine energy against targets that existed in the spaces between good and evil. Traditional concepts of purity were complicated by the nature of their allies: vampires, awakened guardians, and others whose supernatural nature placed them outside conventional religious categories. Isolde felt the bloodstone pendant pulse with sudden recognition as understanding flowed through her enhanced consciousness. "I can do it," she said, stepping forward despite the terror that filled her at the prospect of wielding such power. The Guardian bloodline was created specifically to bridge the gap between mortal innocence and supernatural authority. Alaric turned from his battle with the Chaos entity to study her face, his ancient eyes reflecting both hope and desperate concern. "The cost will be enormous," he warned. "Using the shard will burn away much of what remains of your purely human nature." "Then that's a price I'll pay to protect everyone I care about," Isolde replied, reaching out to accept the crystalline weapon from Father Benedict's trembling hands. The moment her fingers closed around, the Shard of Dawn, power beyond mortal comprehension, flowed through her body like lightning given form and purpose. The bloodstone pendant grew so hot it seemed ready to melt, but instead of pain, she felt only clarity, understanding of her role in the cosmic balance between order and chaos that transcended personal desires or individual survival. Through the shard's divine energy, she could perceive the true nature of the entities they faced. They were fragments of primordial chaos, given hunger and intelligence, creatures that had existed in the void before creation imposed structure on reality. Their presence in the mortal realm represented more than simple invasion. It was an attempt to unravel the fundamental laws that kept existence coherent and stable. The Chaos entities recognized the threat she represented, abandoning their individual attacks on other defenders to converge on her position with unified purpose. Their forms shifted and merged as they moved, becoming a single, massive presence that filled half the great hall, with writhing darkness shot through with veins of sickly light. Inquisitor Cornelius watched the confrontation unfold, with professional fascination mixed with growing horror. His specialized training had prepared him for dealing with individual supernatural threats, but nothing in church doctrine addressed entities that existed outside the traditional framework of divine creation and infernal rebellion. The weapons he carried, blessed through centuries of accumulated religious authority, seemed pathetically inadequate against forces that predated the theological structures that gave those weapons meaning. Sir Gareth positioned himself between the converging Chaos entity and Isolde, the moonstone dagger blazing with silver fire as he prepared for what might be his final battle. His family's ancient oath to protect the Guardian bloodline had led to this moment, standing against forces that threatened not just individual lives, but the very foundations of ordered existence. "Whatever you're going to do," he called back to Isolde, "do it now, before they achieve full manifestation in our reality." The Shard of Dawn pulsed in Isolde's grip like a captured star, its divine energy seeking direction and purpose. Through her enhanced perception, she could see the threads of connection between the Chaos entities and their anchor points throughout the northern territories, cursed amulets that still influenced other noble houses, creating a network of supernatural corruption that spanned kingdoms. All of it could be severed with a single focused strike, but only if she was willing to channel power that would transform her beyond any possibility of return to the purely mortal existence she had once known. The moment of ultimate choice arrived as the merged Chaos entity surged toward Isolde with hunger that sought to devour not just her life, but her very essence, unraveling the divine spark that made mortal existence possible. The Shard of Dawn blazed in her hands with power that could reshape reality itself, but wielding it required a decision that would echo through eternity. Destroy the entities threatening everything she loved, knowing that success would transform her beyond recognition. Time seemed to slow as supernatural forces reached their crescendo. Through her enhanced perception, Isolde could see the threads of connection stretching across the northern territories, linking the Chaos entity before her to every cursed amulet that still influenced mortal lords. One focused strike with the shard could sever all these connections simultaneously, but only if she channeled enough divine energy to burn away the last vestiges of her purely human nature. "I accept the price," she whispered, raising the crystalline weapon as power beyond mortal comprehension flowed through her body. But before she could complete the strike that would save the realm at the cost of her humanity, a new voice cut through the supernatural chaos like a blade through silk. Inquisitor Cornelius stepped forward, no longer the rigid enforcer of church doctrine, but a man whose understanding had been transformed by witnessing forces that transcended institutional authority. "Wait," he called out, withdrawing from his blessed case an artifact that blazed with different but equally powerful energy. "There is another way." The mirror of truth that Cornelius revealed was not the simple reflecting surface it appeared to be, but a window into the fundamental nature of existence that could expose the real source of corruption and reveal solutions hidden from ordinary perception. As he held it up to catch the divine light of the Shard of Dawn, images began forming in its surface, not reflections of the present battle, but visions of truth that cut through deception and illusion. What the mirror revealed changed everything. The chaos entities were not independent invaders, but fragments of a single, massive presence that existed primarily in a parallel dimension, reaching into the mortal realm through anchor points that served as both corruption sources and vulnerabilities. More importantly, the mirror showed that Edric himself carried within his mind a connection to the master entity, not through the destroyed amulet, but through deeper contamination that had occurred when he first accepted the cursed artifact years earlier. "He's the primary anchor," Cornelius announced, his voice carrying new understanding and terrible implication. "Destroying the amulets alone won't be sufficient. The master entity has embedded part of itself in his consciousness, using his mind as the central hub for its network of influence." Edric staggered as the truth hit him like a physical blow. All his efforts at redemption, all his horror at discovering what he had done under supernatural influence, none of it could change the fact that he remained connected to the forces he sought to oppose. The chaos entities had not simply used him, they had made him a permanent part of their presence in the mortal realm. "Then, I know what must be done," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm that came from finally understanding his role in the cosmic balance. Drawing his sword with steady hands, he looked directly at Isolde. "The connection can be severed, but only through the willing sacrifice of the anchor point itself." Alaric moved to stop him, supernatural speed, carrying him across the hall in the blink of an eye, but Edric had already begun the ritual that would transform personal destruction into supernatural victory. The sword he drove into his own chest was not mere steel but silver, blessed through ceremonies older than church doctrine, capable of severing connections between dimensions as well as ending mortal life. "This is my choice," Edric gasped, as divine and supernatural forces converged on his dying form. "My redemption for 3 years of cruelty, my atonement for crimes, committed under influence I was too weak to resist." The chaos entities shrieked as their anchor point dissolved, their forms beginning to waver and lose coherence as the network that maintained their presence in the mortal realm collapsed. But their destruction was not instantaneous. With their master connection severed, the fragments sought new hosts among everyone present, desperate to maintain existence in any form possible. This was the moment the Shard of Dawn was truly needed. Not to channel devastating power that would transform its wielder, but to provide focused purification that could cleanse the supernatural contamination without destroying those it sought to save. Isolde raised the crystalline weapon, but instead of calling upon divine energy that would burn away her humanity, she channeled power through the bloodstone pendant and the accumulated wisdom of her ancestral line. The combination of artifacts created something unprecedented, divine purification filtered through supernatural understanding, cosmic power guided by mortal compassion. Light blazed through the great hall, not the harsh illumination that destroyed indiscriminately, but warm radiance that separated corruption from innocent essence, burning away chaos while preserving the fundamental nature of those it touched. The chaos entities dissolved like shadows before dawn, their existence unraveling as the light touched them. But more importantly, the supernatural contamination that had spread through the northern territories was cleansed simultaneously, freeing every noble house from the cursed influence that had manipulated their actions for years. When the light faded, Isolde stood transformed, but not diminished. The ordeal had awakened her full supernatural heritage without destroying her essential humanity, creating something new, a bridge between mortal and immortal realms that could ensure the ancient compacts would never again be forgotten or ignored. Edric's sacrifice had broken the chaos entity's hold on the mortal realm, but his death also freed Isolde from any remaining legal or supernatural obligation to their false marriage. She was truly free to choose her own path, with power sufficient to protect that choice and wisdom enough to use it responsibly. The great hall fell silent as the supernatural storm subsided, leaving only allies who had been transformed by their shared struggle against forces that threatened the very foundations of existence. 6 months after the battle that had reshaped the balance between mortal and supernatural realms, Raven-Hollow Keep bore little resemblance to the fortress of fear and oppression it had once been. The ancient stones seemed to breathe easier now, their dark history transformed into foundation for something unprecedented, a sanctuary where supernatural and mortal law worked in harmony rather than conflict. Lady Isolde stood in the great hall where her trial had once taken place, but now she faced the gathering of nobles and supernatural beings who had come not as judges but as witnesses to the signing of documents that would establish new precedents for the entire northern region. The bloodstone pendant at her throat pulsed with warm light that reflected the peace she had found in accepting her role as bridge between worlds that had been separated for too long. The new covenant scroll lay open on the table that had once displayed evidence of her alleged crimes. Written in both common script and the ancient languages that predated mortal law, the document established formal recognition of supernatural authority in matters that affected beings existing beyond purely human concerns. More importantly, it created mechanisms for cooperation rather than conflict when the two jurisdictions overlapped. This covenant acknowledges what wise people have always known. Isolde addressed the assembled witnesses, her voice carrying authority that came not from political position, but from understanding earned through trial and transformation. Justice serves no master save truth itself, and truth often requires perspectives that transcend the limitations of any single realm or understanding. Alaric stood beside her, no longer a figure of shadow and mystery, but an acknowledged guardian whose authority rested on ancient law rather than hidden power. The silver ring he had once placed on a courtroom table now sat openly on his hand, its raven crest reflecting light from windows that no longer seemed to filter illumination through layers of fear and oppression. The compact our ancestors sealed 3 centuries ago was wise, he said, addressing mortal nobles who had once dismissed supernatural law as primitive superstition. But wisdom must evolve with changing times, and isolation breeds the very conflicts it seeks to avoid. Sir Gareth, now bearing the title of Guardian Captain rather than simple head of household guard, supervised the ceremony with the moonstone, dagger at his side, no longer hidden weapon, but symbol of his family's restored role in maintaining the balance between realms. His transformation from conflicted soldier to supernatural guardian had been complete, yet he remained recognizably the honorable man who had struggled with impossible loyalties. Father Benedict offered prayers that encompassed both Christian doctrine and older forms of spiritual recognition, his faith having evolved to accommodate truths that institutional theology was slowly learning to accept. The church hierarchy had proven surprisingly adaptable when faced with evidence that supernatural forces could serve divine justice as effectively as earthly authority. May this agreement bring peace to all who seek justice, he intoned, blessing the covenant with authority that spanned both mortal and immortal concerns. And may those who would break such peace find themselves facing powers that transcend their understanding. Among the witnesses sat representatives of neighboring houses whose own supernatural connections had been revealed in the aftermath of the Chaos entity's defeat. The network of ancient compacts and forgotten alliances that had once governed the Northern Territories was being rebuilt on foundations of open cooperation rather than secret influence. Marta, now bearing the formal title of Keeper of Ancient Ways rather than simple lady's maid, placed the blood chalice of binding on the table beside the covenant scroll. The silver vessel gleamed with supernatural light that reflected off the new documents, symbolically linking past agreements with future possibilities. "The old ways were not wrong," she said, her aged voice carrying weight of accumulated wisdom. "They were simply incomplete. Separation breeds fear, and fear breeds the very cruelties we seek to prevent." The political transformation had extended far beyond Ravenshallow Keep. Throughout the Northern Territories, nobles who had been freed from the cursed amulet's influence discovered that their apparent political conflicts had been orchestrated by chaotic forces seeking to weaken both mortal and supernatural authority. Long-standing disputes evaporated as former enemies recognized their shared manipulation by entities that served only discord and suffering. Trade agreements that had been disrupted by years of artificial conflict were restored and strengthened. Military alliances that had crumbled under supernatural harassment were renewed with additional provisions for dealing with threats that transcended purely mortal concerns. The region was experiencing a period of unprecedented cooperation and prosperity. Inquisitor Cornelius had returned to church hierarchy with reports that would reshape official doctrine regarding supernatural intervention in mortal affairs. The rigid categories that had once defined divine, infernal, and supernatural influences were being replaced by more nuanced understanding that recognized the complexity of forces that operated beyond simple theological framework. "Evil is not determined by nature but by choice," he had written in his formal report. "Beings of supernatural origin can serve justice as faithfully as mortal agents of divine will, while mortal authorities can fall to corruption just as easily as any creature of darkness." The crown of shadows remained in its vault, neither needed nor wanted by those who had discovered that cooperation achieved more than individual power ever could. Alaric's choice to reject the artifact's terrible enhancement had proven wise, sustainable solutions required balance rather than overwhelming force. As the ceremony concluded and witnesses dispersed to carry news of the new covenant throughout the region, Isolde and Alaric walked together through gardens that had been transformed from places of isolation into spaces of contemplation and peace. The relationship between them had evolved beyond supernatural protection into partnership of equals who shared responsibility for maintaining the delicate balance between realms. "Do you ever regret the choice?" Alaric asked, referring to her decision to accept supernatural heritage rather than pursue purely mortal freedom. "Never," Isolde replied, touching the bloodstone pendant that had become symbol of her role as bridge between worlds. "Freedom, without the power to protect it, is merely another form of captivity. True liberty comes from understanding our place in the larger pattern and choosing to serve something greater than our individual desires." The transformation of Ravenshallow, Keep from fortress of oppression to sanctuary of justice, had created ripples that would spread throughout the known world. Other regions where supernatural and mortal authority conflicted would look to the Northern Territories as example of what cooperation could achieve when fear was replaced by understanding. The personal crisis that had begun with domestic abuse had evolved into something that reshaped the fundamental relationship between mortal and supernatural realms. Isolde's suffering had not been meaningless. It had become catalyst for changes that would protect countless others from similar cruelties in the future. As twilight painted the sky in colors that her enhanced vision revealed to contain patterns of supernatural significance, Lady Isolde of Ravenshollow stood as living proof that some forms of strength could only be forged in the fires of adversity, and some forms of justice required powers that transcended any single understanding of law or authority. The ancient compact between mortal and supernatural realms had not merely been renewed, it had been transformed into something unprecedented, sustainable, and wise.